Hey biologists, today we're going to talk a little bit more about enzymes and interpreting graphs of enzymes, and then we're going to speak a little bit about how DNA and proteins are related in protein synthesis. So the first thing that we're looking at is an enzymatic graph. So what we're looking at here, if we're looking at the x-axis, remember that x-axis is the horizontal line, the y-axis is the vertical line. On the x-axis, we have the pH. On the y-axis, we have the amount of enzyme activity. So the higher that the line goes, the better that the enzyme is going to be able to work. So the higher the enzyme activity is. So remember, in the last class, we talked about how enzymes have an optimal pH and temperature. If it gets too hot or too cold, or the acidity gets too high or too low, our enzyme can denature. So if we're looking at this graph, this red line represents the activity of an enzyme based off of what the pH of the environment is. The highest point, so the peak of the graph, is always going to be the most optimal environment for the enzyme. So in this case, we are looking at the pH of about 8. So for this enzyme that we'll call maltase, this optimal pH would be at an 8. Now, when we're looking at when an enzyme denatures, you're going to look at where the graph reaches the x-axis, where there's no enzyme activity left. Because remember, when an enzyme denatures, it means that the shape of the enzyme changed and the substrate can no longer fit. Therefore, the enzyme can no longer work. So there are two places where it hits zero enzyme activity, where it crosses that x-axis at about 4.7 here, at about 10.5 here. We'll try one more example together. So here we have another example. The same thing goes. Enzyme activity is on the y-axis. However, on the x-axis now, instead of looking at pH, we're looking at temperature. So in this case, we're going to look for the optimal temperature. Again, the optimal temperature will be at the highest peak on the graph. This is where there's the most enzyme activity. In this case, it would be at 40 degrees Celsius. Where the enzyme denatures, again, this is where the line crosses the x-axis. You might want to say 0, but as you see at 0 degrees Celsius, it still hasn't hit the x-axis. So here would be about 63 degrees Celsius where the enzyme is denatured and no longer works.